we're in Black History Month, and so I thought I would focus today on the question, who is the greatest Black American of our history? In fact, not just who's the greatest, but who's number one, who's number two, who's number three. Now, if you went to Black Studies departments or progressive scholars and asked them to give you their ranking, I think that their ranking would go like this. They would put Martin Luther King as number one, and they would have Frederick Douglass, the runaway slave, as number two, and they would probably have W.E.B. Du Bois as number three. And you can see that this is a ranking that is somewhat weighted in the progressive favor. And by that I mean Martin Luther King was not really, I wouldn't say clearly a Republican or a Democrat. He tended to avoid a clear identification with either party. Now, I've seen some people on social media go, Martin Luther King was a Republican. I'm actually not aware of any evidence that he specifically called himself that. Now, his father, I believe, was a Republican. Martin Luther King, I think, was sort of nothing, neither party. But he did more openly identify with Kennedy, JFK, and then certainly with LBJ, with the signing of the Civil Rights Act. I think it's probably fair to say that Martin Luther King was clearly in the Democratic camp by 1964, and if anything, he moved further left after that. So you can see the progressives are picking King because he's one of ours. We don't like his colorblind thing all that much today, but nevertheless, he was on our side. Frederick Douglass was a Republican, but you'll notice that a lot of progressive histories that talk about Frederick Douglass never mention that about him. They act like he was just, a runaway slave, and he went on to become a prominent abolitionist leader, but you'll very rarely see the words GOP or Republican Party associated with Frederick Douglass, even though Frederick Douglass became a Republican officially, was a Republican appointee, he was a diplomat in a Republican administration. And he famously said, although it's not so famous today because you don't see it highlighted, he said the Republican Party is the ship, all else is the sea, meaning you got to be a Republican, particularly if you're Black. Your only future is in the Republican Party. And third, Du Bois, who was not only a leftist, but became a socialist. In fact, became so anti-American that he left America and he moved to Ghana. And he died, I believe, at the age of 90 or 91 in Ghana when he was affirming African solidarity. He was at that point vehemently against the United States, to the point where he even said sympathetic things about Stalin and even Hitler. I don't think that W.E.B. Du Bois belongs in this top three ranking at all. I do agree with the other two, but I would rearrange it. In fact, I would argue that the greatest American of our history, greatest Black American, is in fact Frederick Douglass. Far greater than, let's say, Martin Luther King. And let's look at why. First of all, Martin Luther King affirmed the colorblind ideal, and that was important. But let's remember that the moral argument against racism, the moral argument for treating people based on the content of their character, was actually a moral argument that was won at the end of World War II. Once American troops went in the gas chambers and people saw, this is the fruits of racial supremacy. This is what Nordic Nazi ideology has produced. The moral argument for racism basically collapsed. And this is why when Martin Luther King was fighting in the civil rights movement, he was fighting against some dogs and hoses and Southern sheriffs and Bull Connor, but he wasn't really fighting against a rival ideology. No one stepped forward and said, sorry, Martin Luther King, you're completely wrong. Here are 10 reasons why segregation is fantastic. No one did that. Why? Because the case for segregation had already collapsed. Now, Douglass, on the other hand, unlike Martin Luther King, endured slavery. So he obviously suffered far more. He wrote a masterpiece, his autobiography, the autobiography of Frederick Douglass. Notice that Martin Luther King has the letter from the Birmingham jail, which is very well worth reading. He has his famous I Have a Dream speech, but he has nothing like a classic work penned by him, which Frederick Douglass has. Frederick Douglass also had a very poignant meeting with Lincoln, in which he kind of changed his view about Lincoln. He was initially very skeptical about Lincoln, but then he realized, hey, listen, yeah, Lincoln's not giving me any special treatment. He's not the great Frederick Douglass, but he is treating me as a man. He's treating me basically as no different, whether I'm white, whether I'm black. Lincoln doesn't really see color. So in this sense, it's Frederick Douglass who's the true author of the colorblind idea, and not so much Martin Luther King. And finally, Frederick Douglass went on to talk about what he called the self-made man. By the way, this is an idea also developed by the man who is, in my view, the second greatest Black American, and that's Booker T. Washington. So in my ranking, it's Frederick Douglass number 1, it's Booker T. Washington number 2, and it's Martin Luther King number 3.